My husband told me I'm leaving you for your best friend. I'm happier with her." In one sentence, he took my marriage, my trust, and the life I thought I understood, and left me standing in my own kitchen with nothing but the sound of the coffee maker still gurgling behind me. I thought that was the moment I lost everything. I had no idea that 6 days later, an attorney from Oregon would call and tell me that my first husband, a man I had not seen in more than 20 years, had died and left me everything he owned. There was only one condition. I had to appear in person unmarried within 30 days. My name is Catherine Marsh, and for 11 years I was married to a man named Derek. We lived in a beige colonial house in Columbus, Ohio, in the kind of neighborhood where everyone waved from their driveways and nobody really talked. I was 44. Derek was 47. We had a shared mortgage, a golden retriever named Biscuit, a kitchen we had renovated twice, and a routine so familiar it felt like furniture. Comfortable. Invisible. Taken for granted. I worked as a senior editor at a regional health publishing company. It was respectable, stable work. I left the house at 8 every morning, came home at 6 every evening, and made dinner most nights while Derek watched the game or scrolled through his phone at the kitchen island. We were not unhappy in the explosive way. We were unhappy in the quiet, eroding way. Like a foundation settling under a house, cracking in places too small to notice until the wall finally splits. My best friend was Linda Chow. We had known each other since graduate school. 20 years of birthday dinners, bad dates debriefed over wine, shared grief when her mother died, shared joy when I got my promotion. She was the person I called when I did not know what else to do. She was, I believed, the truest constant in my life. Looking back, I can see the signs. I just did not want to see them then. Derek started going to the gym more often, which did not seem unusual for a man approaching 50. But then I noticed he was showering before going, not after. He began texting at odd hours. His phone was always face down on every surface angled away from me, as if hiding it had become instinct. He stopped initiating anything. Conversation, touch, shared plans. When I suggested a trip to Vermont for our anniversary, he said he would think about it. He never brought it up again. And Linda changed too. Linda started being busy. She canceled our Thursday dinners once, then twice, and then canceling became the new rule. She answered my texts with single words. She had always had a full life, so I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things that year. Then came the Saturday that divided my life into before and after. It was October. I remember because the sugar maple in our front yard had turned the most extraordinary red, and I had been meaning to photograph it for days. Derek came downstairs carrying a bag. Just one bag. Somehow that told me he had been planning this for a while. He set it by the door, and something about the careful way he placed it there made my stomach drop. "We need to talk," he said. He did not look guilty. That was the thing I was not prepared for. He looked relieved. "I'm leaving," he said. "I'm in love with Linda." The room did not spin. I did not collapse. I just stood very still in my own kitchen, with the coffee maker still making its little morning sounds, and I felt something cold and final move through me like a tide going out. "Linda," I repeated. "She makes me feel alive, Catherine. I'm sorry. I know this is—" "Get out," I said quietly. I was not even angry yet. I was only certain. He left. The door clicked shut with a sound like something sealing. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I went to the window and looked at the maple tree, still red, still beautiful, while the world remained entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside my house. I did not call anyone. I did not cry. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, and Biscuit came over and put his heavy head in my lap. I stared at the ceiling and thought, so this is what it feels like to lose everything at once. 6 days later, my phone rang with an unknown number. "May I speak with Catherine Marsh Holloway?" The voice was formal and careful. "This is Catherine Marsh," I said. I had not used the name Holloway in over 20 years. "Ms. Marsh, my name is Robert Adler. I'm a probate attorney in Portland, Oregon. I'm contacting you regarding the estate of Thomas Holloway, your former husband. Mr. Holloway passed away last month. He left a will, and you are the sole named beneficiary." There was a pause. The estate is valued at approximately $4.2 million. However, there is one condition attached to the bequest. I sat down very slowly. What condition? I asked. Mr. Holloway stipulated that you must appear in person at our Portland office within 30 days of notification to begin the transfer process. He also stipulated that you must provide documentation confirming you are not currently legally married. I almost laughed. Derek had made sure that would matter, hadn't he? I'll be there, I said. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my half-empty house. For the first time in 6 days, I felt something other than cold. I felt the faint, dangerous spark of possibility. The week after Derek left, I counted what remained. Not dramatically. Practically. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and wrote down everything. The house was in both our names, which meant nothing could be sold or refinanced without agreement. The joint checking account held about $18,000. Derek had already transferred his direct deposit. I checked online and saw the balance had not moved in days, which meant he had planned this longer than a week. The savings account, the one we had built over 11 years, had been drained down to $400. He had taken just over $60,000. I stared at that number for a long time. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from danger, but from vulnerability. From realizing you had been standing on ground you assumed was solid, and it was not. I had made choices over the years that felt like partnership, and now they revealed themselves as exposure. I had reduced my hours when Derek and I discussed having children we never had. I had let Derek handle the investment accounts because he said he was better at it. I had trusted him. I let myself be afraid for exactly 2 days. On the 3rd day, I called Robert Adler back. "Tell me everything about the condition," I said, not the summary, the precise language. Robert Adler read me the clause from Thomas Holloway's will. Thomas was my first husband, the man I divorced in 1997 after 3 years of marriage that had, if I was honest, simply been too quiet and too careful. We had been two people who respected each other more than we loved each other. We had parted without bitterness. He had moved to Oregon, built a software company in the early days of the internet, sold it quietly, and apparently lived well and alone for the rest of his life. He had never remarried, and he had left everything to me. The condition was straightforward. I had to appear in person unmarried within 30 days. There was a secondary clause. If I did not appear, or if I appeared while still married, the estate would be distributed to a list of environmental charities Thomas had named. There was no provision for Derek, no loophole, no contest mechanism beyond a 60-day challenge window that required proof of undue influence, which did not apply. The math was simple. I was legally married to Derek. That was the problem. Divorce in Ohio takes time. An uncontested divorce where both parties agree on asset division can move relatively quickly, sometimes 60 to 90 days. But Derek and I had a shared mortgage, a disputed savings account, and now I had every reason to believe he would not make this easy. A contested divorce could take a year. I had 30 days. I sat with that constraint and turned it over like a stone, looking at every angle. Then I thought, what if Derek does not know about the inheritance? That was the seed of it. Not a plan yet, just a question. If Derek knew $4 million were attached to my name, he would do one of two things. He would contest the divorce to delay it and demand a share, or he would suddenly become cooperative in ways designed to benefit himself. Either way, he would use the information as leverage. So he could not know. Not yet. I called a divorce attorney named Patricia Owens, a woman with a reputation for precision and no patience for games. I found her that afternoon and drove to her office on High Street the next morning. I did not tell her about the inheritance right away. Not because I planned to hide it forever. Patricia would need to know eventually. But I needed to understand the legal landscape before I revealed any card. I asked her about expedited divorce proceedings in Ohio. I asked about legal separation as a distinct status. I asked what grounds could accelerate the timeline. Patricia listened without interrupting, which told me she was good. "You can file immediately," she said. "If Derek signs a separation agreement, we can potentially finalize quickly with a waiver. But if he contests anything..." She paused. "Is there reason to think he will?" "He took $60,000 from our joint savings before he left," I said. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "Then we file today," she said, "and we document everything." Walking out of Patricia's office, I felt the fear reshape into something different. Not disappear, but redirect. Fear can be a fog, or it can be fuel, and I had decided it would be the latter. I had 30 days to become legally unmarried. I had a man who had stolen from me and thought I was defenseless. I had a best friend who had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. And I had a secret neither of them knew existed. For the first time since that Saturday in October, I almost smiled.
Patricia filed the divorce petition on a Tuesday. Derek was served 3 days later at the apartment he and Linda were sharing. The process server noted that detail in his report with professional neutrality. I read that line 3 times. They were already living together. Linda's apartment. The same apartment I had helped her move into 4 years earlier. The one whose bedroom I had painted because she hated doing it alone. I set the report down and breathed. Derek called me that same evening. I let it go to voicemail, then listened once, then deleted it. He used the word reasonable 4 times in 90 seconds. Men who take $60,000 and then use the word reasonable are telling you exactly who they are. I did not call back. What I did instead was begin gathering. Patricia had advised me to collect documentation, bank statements, records of shared assets, and any communication that established the timeline of Derek's actions. I spent 3 evenings at my kitchen table with a scanner and a spreadsheet, methodical and quiet. I found the transfer records. I found emails. Derek had used our shared computer occasionally and had not cleared the browser history. He and Linda had been corresponding since the previous March. 7 months. They had been planning this for 7 months while I made dinner and asked about Vermont. The emails were not salacious. They were almost worse than that. They were practical. Discussions of timelines. Discussions of when Derek would tell me. Discussions of how Linda would handle my reaction. There was one message in which Linda wrote, "She'll be devastated, but she'll survive. She always lands on her feet." Derek had replied, "That's what I keep telling myself." I printed those emails and put them in a folder. I was not going to use them emotionally. I was going to use them legally. Patricia had flagged something important. If we could demonstrate that Derek's withdrawal of the $60,000 constituted marital waste dissipation of assets in anticipation of divorce, we could seek that amount back as part of the settlement. The emails which showed premeditation strengthened that argument considerably. Meanwhile, something was shifting with Derek and Linda. I knew because of small things. Derek's attorney, a man named Gary Feltz, who specialized in what Patricia privately called second-act divorces, meaning men leaving long marriages, sent a letter requesting an inventory of all marital assets. Standard procedure. But the letter came faster than I expected, and it was oddly specific in its language, asking about any recently discovered assets or inheritance interests. I read that phrase twice. Had they heard something? How Robert Adler's office was in Portland. I had not told anyone. The only people who knew were me and the attorney's office. I called Robert Adler's paralegal and asked carefully whether the notification of my inheritance had been communicated to any other party. She confirmed it had not. Probate notifications were private, and no inquiry had been made to their office. So it was a fishing expedition. Gary Feltz had written that clause as a standard tactic, trying to surface anything I might be concealing. It was routine, and it had rattled me for no reason. But it told me something. Derek's side was already looking for leverage. They were treating this as a transaction, not a dissolution. That meant I had to be more careful. I flew to Portland on a Thursday. Robert Adler's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building near the waterfront. He was a small man with silver hair and the kind of careful manner that comes from decades of delivering difficult news. He walked me through the will and the estate assets, which included a property in Bend, a brokerage account, and residual proceeds from a partial stake Thomas had retained in his original company after the sale. "Thomas spoke of you," Robert Adler said with some hesitation. "We weren't in contact," I said. "Not for years." "No," he said, "but he followed your career. He told me once that marrying you was the right thing, and divorcing you was the right thing, and that he had always wished you well." He paused. He was a private man. I looked out the window at the gray water of the Willamette River and felt something complicated. Grief for a man I had once loved gently and lost quietly. Gratitude for a kindness I had not expected. And a sharp awareness that this inheritance was also a test. Thomas had attached the condition not to punish me,
but I suspected because he had known somehow that money given without conditions tends to get entangled in other people's claims. He had protected me from beyond his own life.
I signed the initial documentation. The clock was ticking. I now had 22 days to finalize the divorce, or the condition would become impossible to meet in time. I flew home that night. When I landed and turned my phone back on, I had a text from Linda. "Can we talk? I think there's been a misunderstanding." 20 years of friendship, 7 months of planning behind my back, and now misunderstanding? I put my phone in my bag and walked to my car. There was nothing to misunderstand. But I was beginning to understand, quite a lot still to do. The next 10 days were the most deliberately purposeful of my life. Patricia moved quickly. Ohio allowed for an expedited hearing once both parties had been served and a settlement conference was scheduled. The purpose was to reduce court backlog, not to accommodate my personal timeline, but the effect was the same. We had a conference scheduled for day 8. I needed Derek to sign, or I needed a judge to rule without him. I had the dissipation evidence, I had the emails, I had the bank transfer records. Patricia used them not as emotional leverage, but as legal facts. She sent Gary Feltz a formal letter outlining our intent to seek recovery of the $60,000 plus interest, citing the documented premeditation. The message was clear. Cooperate on the timeline or face a prolonged proceeding in which Derek's conduct would be entered into the public record. Derek signed the separation agreement on day 6. I do not know exactly what conversation happened between him and his attorney, but I suspect Gary Feltz told him that contesting the divorce would cost more than it was worth. Derek had taken the money thinking I would be too grief-stricken to act. He had underestimated me. Most people who betray someone badly tend to underestimate them. It is easier to believe your victim is helpless than to sit with the knowledge of what you have done. He signed. He got to keep $30,000 of the $60,000. Patricia negotiated it that way, and I conceded that point. I was buying time, not treasure. Then on day 9, everything shifted. I was at Patricia's office when her assistant knocked and said someone was in the lobby. Derek had arrived unannounced, without his attorney, asking to speak with me. Patricia looked at me. I nodded. He came in looking like a man who had done arithmetic and disliked the answer. Not remorseful. Recalibrating.
"I heard you went to Portland," he said.
I said nothing. Gary found something in a public record search, he said. A probate filing. Thomas Holloway. He paused, watching my face. He left you money. I kept my expression flat. That's a private matter. We're still legally married, Derek said, which means in Ohio... He stopped, then finished carefully. Community property laws may apply to assets acquired during the marriage.
Ohio is not a community property state, Patricia said from her chair without looking up from her notes. It is an equitable distribution state. And you signed a separation agreement this morning. Derek looked at her, then back at me. I want to revisit that agreement. You signed it 4 hours ago, Patricia said. It has been filed. The silence in the room was very particular. The kind that comes after someone realizes the door he thought was open has already closed. You planned this? Derek said to me. His voice had changed. The reasonableness was gone, replaced by something colder. I filed for divorce, I said. You left me for my best friend. I don't know what you expected. He leaned forward. Linda knows people, Catherine. Her brother is a real estate attorney. We can make the house situation very complicated. The house situation, Patricia said, is governed by the signed agreement you filed this morning. She looked at him now. I would suggest you consult with your attorney before continuing this conversation. Derek stood. He looked at me with something that wanted to be contempt, but landed closer to desperation. You'll regret cutting me out, he said. I already regret quite a lot, I said. None of it involves this morning. He left. My hands were trembling slightly under the table. Patricia noticed. Go home, she said. We have what we need. The hearing is in 4 days. Let me handle the rest. I went home. I fed Biscuit. I sat on the back porch for a long time in the cold, watching the last of the October light die behind the neighbor's fence. The fear I had been running on was real. Derek's threat about Linda's brother was not nothing, and I knew it. Real estate entanglements could delay everything. But Patricia was right. The agreement was filed. I had documentation. I had a court date. I had a secret worth more than Derek's anger. I gave myself 3 days. I watched bad television. I cooked soup from scratch. I walked Biscuit for long miles through quiet streets. I called no one.
I thought deliberately slow thoughts. Then I got ready for what came next. On the second day of my rest, Linda called. Not a text this time, a call. I watched her name on the screen for 4 full rings and then declined it. 20 minutes later, she called again. I declined again. Then she left a voicemail. I listened once. Her voice was carefully modulated, the voice she used in professional settings and difficult conversations. The voice of a woman who had once helped me rehearse a speech before my company's annual conference. Catherine, I know you're angry, and I understand that, but I think you're making decisions right now that you might regret. Derek and I know how this looks, but there are things you don't know. Things about your marriage that Derek never told you. And I think if we could just sit down. There was a pause. I'm reaching out as your friend. Please call me back. I erased the voicemail. Things you don't know about your marriage. What a precise little blade that was. The implication that I had been naive, that the truth had been kept from me for my own good, that the betrayal was somehow an act of charity. It was a manipulation so old it had a name, and I had edited enough psychological content at work to recognize it without blinking. What struck me, sitting in my quiet kitchen with Biscuit at my feet, was how calm I felt. Not the numbness of shock, that had passed. This was something cleaner. I had a direction, a legal process, a deadline, and a goal. I had, in other words, a future. Linda and Derek had mistaken my grief for weakness and my silence for paralysis. They were watching me, I could feel it, waiting for me to crack, collapse, call, beg, ask for an explanation, ask what I had done wrong. They would wait a long time. But calm is not the same as armored, and I knew I needed more than solitude. I called my sister Renee, who lived in Cincinnati, and whom I had been too proud to call in the first 2 weeks. I told her everything. Derek, Linda, the inheritance, the timeline. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Renee said, I'm driving up Saturday. She arrived with a casserole and a fury on my behalf that was both generous and necessary. We sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours. She asked good questions. She did not try to reframe the situation as an opportunity for growth. She let it be what it was for a while, a betrayal. And then, when I was ready, she helped me think. Renee had gone through her own divorce 6 years earlier. She knew the emotional landscape. The hardest part, she said, isn't the anger. It's the identity. You've been Catherine and Derek for 11 years. You've been Catherine and Linda for 20. You're not either of those things anymore, and that is terrifying even when it is also a relief. I had not let myself acknowledge the relief yet. I also called my colleague Janine, who worked in our legal department and was the most practically intelligent person I knew. I did not tell her about the inheritance. I kept that close. But I talked through the divorce process, the timeline, and the pressure I was navigating. Janine listened, then said, You need to document every contact attempt from either of them from this point forward. Screenshot, timestamp, save. Harassment and intimidation in a divorce proceeding is actionable. I started a folder on my phone that same evening. By the end of the week, I had my sister's warmth, Janine's pragmatism, Patricia's legal expertise, and my own exhausted but functional determination. The court hearing was 3 days away. Derek and Linda were watching. I could feel it in the careful silences, in the absence of further contact, in the way Gary Feltz's latest letter to Patricia was shorter and more cautious than the ones before. They were waiting to see what I would do. I already knew what I was going to do. I had known since the afternoon I sat on the kitchen floor with Biscuit and felt that first spark of possibility. I was going to win. 3 days before the court hearing, Derek and Linda came to my house together unannounced. I saw Derek's car in the driveway from the upstairs window and felt something cold move through me. Not quite fear, something adjacent to it. I stood still for a moment, looking down at them through the glass. Linda was wearing the green coat I had helped her pick out last winter. She looked up at the house and then looked away. Derek rang the doorbell. I thought about not answering. Then I thought about Janine's advice. Document everything. I turned on the voice memo app on my phone, tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan, and went downstairs. I opened the door. I did not invite them in. I stood in the doorway. We just want to talk, Derek said. His tone was the one I recognized from every difficult conversation in our marriage. Carefully neutral, designed to make the other person feel that resistance would be unreasonable. "We could sit at your kitchen table," Linda said, "like adults." "We can stand here," I said. A pause. Then Derek shifted his weight and said, "We're concerned about you, Catherine. We think you're making impulsive decisions because you're hurt, which is completely understandable." "I filed for divorce," I said. "You left me for my best friend. What decision would you have me make instead?" Linda stepped forward slightly. "I think you have the wrong idea about the timeline, about what happened between Derek and me. We didn't plan." "I have your emails," I said. The silence was immediate and absolute. Linda recovered first. She always was quick. "Those were private communications," she said. "If you access them through Derek's account, that could actually be a legal issue for you." "They were on a shared household computer," I said, "in a browser history that was not cleared. My attorney has reviewed them." "Your attorney is welcome to discuss their admissibility with her." Derek looked at Linda. It lasted a fraction of a second, but it was involuntary and decisive. In that tiny look, I saw that they had miscalculated. They had come there thinking I was still the woman I had been in October, the one standing in her kitchen being handed the end of her life. They had not updated their model of me. "What do you actually want here?" I asked. Derek took a breath. "The separation agreement. There are terms we would like to revisit. The house, specifically. If your financial situation has changed, then a reassessment of the asset division seems fair." So there it was. Not concern for me, not a desire for peace. They wanted to reopen the agreement before the court hearing locked it in. "The agreement is filed," I said. "It was reviewed and signed by both parties." "Agreements can be modified," Linda said gently, like it was a reasonable suggestion. "No one is threatening anyone, Catherine. We're just asking you to be flexible, to consider the bigger picture." "The bigger picture," I repeated. "You're going to have resources," Derek said. He could not help it. The directness broke through. "There's no reason for this to be adversarial. We could come to an arrangement, a private one." I looked at them both. My sister's words came back to me. "You are not those things anymore." I had spent 20 years trusting Linda and 11 years building a life with Derek, and they were standing on my porch asking me to quietly hand them a portion of a dead man's kindness. "I would like you both to leave," I said. "Catherine, if you contact me again outside formal legal channels," I said, "I will file for harassment. My attorney has advised me on the threshold. Do not test it." Derek's expression closed over. The careful neutrality burned off, replaced by something harder and uglier. "You're making an enemy," he said. "I know," I said. "Close the gate when you leave." I shut the door. I stood in my hallway with my back against it and breathed. My heart was going very fast. Biscuit nosed my hand and I held his head and breathed more slowly. I was not without fear. I want to be honest about that. They had resources. They had Linda's brother's legal knowledge. They had 11 years of knowing exactly which of my habits were vulnerabilities. Derek knew I hated confrontation. He knew I had historically backed down rather than prolong conflict. He was betting I would fold. But the fear when it came did not unravel me. It clarified me. Each threat, each manipulation, each performance of reasonableness that was actually coercion added a layer to something hardening in me. Quiet and final. I sent the recording to Patricia that night with a 3-word message. They came by. Her response came 20 minutes later. "Perfect. See you Thursday." The hearing was at 9 in the morning on a Thursday in November. Columbus in November is gray and flat and without apology, and I drove to the courthouse in the kind of early morning dark that makes everything feel provisional. I wore a dark blue blazer. I carried a folder of documents. I had Patricia beside me. I was ready. Derek and Gary Feltz were already in the corridor when we arrived. Linda was not there. She had no legal standing in the proceeding, though I suspected she was somewhere nearby waiting. Derek's eyes found me immediately. I met them without expression and looked away first, only because I had other things to look at. Gary Feltz requested a brief conference before we entered. Patricia agreed. The 4 of us stood in a side corridor. "My client would like to make a final offer," Gary said. He was careful and professional, the language bleached of anything personal.
a reassessment of the asset division to include a 50% share of any inheritance received within 12 months of the divorce filing, on the grounds that Ohio is an equitable distribution state. Inheritances are generally treated as separate property, Patricia said. Your grounds are weak. We would argue they were anticipated as marital assets, given that Thomas Holloway died before the divorce filing. The notification came after Patricia said, "The inheritance itself precedes the marriage entirely. It is a bequest from a premarital relationship. We will be happy to argue this before the judge." Gary Feltz was good, but he was working with a weak hand and he knew it. He paused. "My client would accept 30%. We are not here to negotiate inheritances," Patricia said. "We are here to finalize a divorce under the terms of an already signed agreement." We walked into the courtroom. The hearing itself was brief in the way legal proceedings are brief when the documentation is thorough. That means it felt nothing like the weight it carried, which was the entire shape of my future. The judge reviewed the agreement. Gary Feltz attempted to raise the issue of the inheritance, citing what he called changed financial circumstances. Patricia objected. The judge asked him to establish legal grounds. He could not. The inheritance was separate property received post-separation and derived from a premarital relationship. The judge overruled the objection. The agreement was confirmed. My marriage to Derek Marsh ended at 10:14 in the morning on a Thursday in November in a courtroom that smelled like old paper and central heating. I walked out into the corridor. Derek was waiting. Linda was there now. She had come inside at some point and was standing at the end of the hall in her green coat. For a moment, I had the strange sensation of seeing two people I had loved standing together in a government building, wearing the faces of people I no longer recognized. Derek stepped toward me. His composure was gone. "This isn't over," he said. "Gary is filing a challenge to the inheritance classification. We'll tie this up in appeals for a year. You'll spend everything you inherit on legal fees before you see a dollar." "That's your right," I said. "How are you this calm?" he asked. He genuinely wanted to know. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the kitchen floor in October, the maple tree Renee driving up with a casserole, Robert Adler telling me Thomas had wished me well. "Because I know how this ends," I said. Linda moved forward then, and her face had lost its careful management, the professional warmth, the sympathetic angles. What was underneath was uglier and more honest. "You were never going to keep him," she said. "I didn't take anything from you. I just got there first." I looked at her for a moment. "Keep him," I said, "was never actually the goal." I walked to the elevator. Patricia was already there. The doors opened and I stepped inside. As they closed, I had one last view of the corridor. Derek's jaw was tight. Linda's hand was on his arm. Gary Feltz was speaking quietly to both of them. The gray fluorescent light made everyone look a little less than they had imagined themselves to be. Then the doors shut. Gary Feltz filed his challenge to the inheritance classification within the week. I had expected it. Patricia had expected it. She had already begun preparing the response, which was considerably more detailed than anything Gary had access to. The challenge rested on two arguments. First, that the inheritance constituted a marital asset because the divorce had not been finalized at the time of notification. Second, that Thomas Holloway's bequest was influenced by the circumstances of my marriage, making it a response to marital events and therefore quasi-marital property. Both arguments were creative. Neither was solid. The first collapsed immediately under the timeline. Thomas Holloway had died before I filed for divorce, meaning the potential inheritance had existed independently of any marital context. The notification came after filing, but the asset predated the marriage entirely. Thomas was my first husband, from a relationship that had ended 27 years earlier. No Ohio court had ever classified a premarital inheritance that way, and Patricia had 3 precedents ready. The second argument required proving that Thomas had learned of my marital difficulties and made his bequest in response. That meant they would have to prove intent, which would require access to Thomas's private records and communications. Robert Adler, when contacted, confirmed that Thomas had executed his will 4 years earlier, when I was still married to Derek, and had given no indication of marital problems. The will had never been amended. Thomas had simply and quietly always intended to leave what he had to the woman he had once married, and never stopped wishing well. Gary Feltz withdrew the challenge 6 weeks after filing. The news came in a 1-paragraph letter to Patricia's office. She forwarded it to me with a single-line note. "It's done." I sat in my office at the publishing company and read it 3 times. Then I set the paper down, folded my hands on the desk,
and allowed myself 1 full minute of stillness. Not celebration, something quieter than that. The particular exhale of a person who has held her breath for months and is finally permitted to breathe. Then I called Robert Adler. "We can proceed," I said. "I'll have the transfer documentation ready by the end of the week," he said. "Congratulations, Ms. Marsh." The property in Bend sold in February, in a market that had been stubborn but moved for a well-priced house in a desirable location. The brokerage account transferred. The residual stake proceeds, which had been accumulating quietly in an Oregon trust, finalized in March. The total received was $4,240,000. After Oregon and federal tax obligations, it came to $3,100,000 and some change. I sat with my financial advisor, a woman I had sought out specifically for her specialization in sudden wealth management, and we made a careful, undramatic plan. I bought a house outright in a neighborhood I had always admired. I placed a portion in low-risk index funds. I retained a portion liquid. I made a donation to an environmental organization Thomas had supported, which felt right and necessary. Patricia sent me a bottle of wine with a handwritten note that said simply, "Well done." I kept the note. I drank the wine slowly over 2 evenings alone on my back porch with Biscuit at my feet and the November sky doing what November skies do, turning everything honest and bare. The Columbus house, the one Derek and I had shared, sold in April. Under the terms of the agreement, we split the equity. Derek received $112,000. I received the same, which I added to the liquid fund. I moved in May. Derek tried once more in early spring to reach me directly, not through attorneys, but through a text message. "I hope you know this wasn't personal." I showed it to Janine, who confirmed it was not legally actionable, and then I blocked his number. There was nothing to say to a man who believed that leaving his wife for her best friend, stealing $60,000, and attempting to claim a dead man's inheritance could be described as impersonal. Some sentences do not deserve a response. They deserve silence. And silence was the one thing I had perfected.
Linda sent a card in February.
An actual paper card, store-bought, with a watercolor of snowdrops on the front. Inside, she had written, "I think of you often. I hope you're well." There was no return address, as though she had anticipated I would not write back. I put the card in the recycling bin. I did not hate either of them. That was the most unexpected outcome of everything. I had moved through anger and grief and the cold purposefulness of those November weeks, and what I arrived at on the other side was something more spacious than hatred. A simple, clear disinterest. They existed. I existed. We moved through different worlds now. I had my house. I had my work, which I returned to with more focus than I had felt in years. I had Biscuit, who adapted to the new backyard with characteristic enthusiasm. I had Renee, who came to stay for a week in June and help me unpack. I had, more than anything, the particular freedom of a person who has survived something and emerged from it knowing exactly what she is made of. By the following autumn, I had learned to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. This took longer than I expected. When you have spent months in a defensive crouch constantly scanning for the next threat, the absence of threat does not feel like peace at first. It feels like the quiet before something. I had to teach myself, slowly, and with the help of a therapist I had started seeing in January, to recognize safety when I was in it. My new house was in Bexley, a neighborhood of old trees and good sidewalks, the kind of streets that reward walking. I had a home office now, and I began taking on consulting work alongside my regular job, helping smaller health publishers with editorial strategy. The work was interesting in ways my career had not been in years. I was sought out rather than simply present. My opinion carried weight in rooms where, for too long, I had made myself small and agreeable. I stopped doing that. I found I did not miss it. Biscuit turned 8 and remained ridiculous and devoted. I made new friends, slowly, in the way adults make friends through proximity and repeated exposure and the gradual discovery of shared perspective. My neighbor Margaret had strong opinions about bird feeders and turned out to be one of the driest and funniest people I had ever met. Janine and I had lunch twice a month and talked less about work than I expected. Renee and I spoke every Sunday without fail. These were not dramatic connections. No one swept into my life and transformed it. They were the steady, ordinary kind of relationships that actually hold. The ones built conversation by conversation. The ones you can rely on without performance. In late spring, I went to Portland. I wanted to see where Thomas had lived. I did not know exactly why. It felt like something owed, some acknowledgement of a generosity so quiet it had arrived after death.
I visited his house in the West Hills, which had already been sold according to the estate plan. But I walked the street and looked at the view of the city below. I thought about a man who had been my husband for 3 years in my mid-20s. A man who had been too quiet and too careful. A man I had parted from without bitterness. A man who had spent the rest of his life wishing me well without expectation. I stood on that sidewalk for a long time. A woman walking a dog passed me and nodded. A child on a bicycle wobbled past. The city went about its day, indifferent and alive. And I thought, Thomas, I hope you knew. Not that I would succeed. He could not have anticipated any of the specifics. But I hoped he knew that his kindness had landed somewhere worth landing, that it had not been wasted. I had a good dinner alone in a restaurant with a view of the river. I ordered something I had never tried, drank 1 glass of Oregon Pinot Noir, and watched the light change on the water until the waiter brought the check without being asked. I flew home feeling something I could only describe as grounded. As for Derek and Linda, I knew only what made its way to me indirectly, through Renee, who heard from mutual acquaintances, and through the ordinary channels by which small city information moves. It had not gone well. Linda's apartment had turned out to be insufficient for 2 adults with incompatible habits, and as it emerged, some fundamental disagreements about money. Derek's assumption of a shared financial life with Linda had collided with Linda's considerable debt, which she had not disclosed until they were living together. Derek, whose own finances had been reduced by the divorce settlement and legal fees, was not positioned to absorb it. There were arguments. Renee heard this from a woman who lived in Linda's building. Loud enough arguments to become a topic of conversation in the corridor. By the following spring, Derek had moved into a studio apartment across town. Linda was, by all accounts, still in her apartment, managing the debt with difficulty and no longer in contact with Derek. Whether it had been a formal break or simply a collapse was unclear. Either way, what had required the destruction of a 20-year friendship and an 11-year marriage had lasted less than 18 months before becoming simply a problem to be managed. The grand passion, the inevitable love, the thing worth burning everything for. It had turned out to be a studio apartment and unpaid credit card statements. I will not say I was glad. That is not quite right. I felt the distant, impersonal understanding of someone watching an inevitable conclusion arrive on its own schedule. I thought sometimes about what Linda had said in the courthouse corridor. She had told me she had not taken anything from me. She had said she just got there first. She had been wrong in a way that had nothing to do with Derek. What she had taken was trust. Not my trust in Derek, which was worth little by the end, but my foundational belief that I knew who my people were, that I had built reliable ground. That belief, it turned out, had been my most valuable asset. Rebuilding it took longer than any legal proceeding. But it was rebuilt. By the 2nd October, a full year after the morning Derek had stood in our kitchen with his bag, I was sitting on my back porch in Bexley on an afternoon warm for October, watching Biscuit investigate the fence line with great seriousness. I looked at the light over the yard and thought, this is mine. Not the house, not the inheritance, not the new career momentum, though all of those were real. The life, the actual days of it, the feeling of waking up in the morning and knowing that everything I encountered that day would be something I had chosen. That was mine. I had paid for it in a currency I had not expected to spend. I would not have chosen the price. But I had paid it, and I was here. October was beautiful again. Biscuit had found something fascinating near the fence post. The afternoon light was long and gold and entirely, completely mine. If this story taught me anything, it is that betrayal reveals 2 things at once. It reveals who other people really are, and it reveals who you really are. I did not know what I was capable of until I had no other choice but to find out. So keep your plans quiet. Let people underestimate you. Never confuse someone's silence for weakness. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most prepared.